I'm happy to introduce our second guest of the evening. And for me, and to the world, he is a master in the field of leadership. I've always turned to Steve on the topic. He developed an assessment methodology, several of these methodologies I actually believe, and being a thought leader, giants such as Egon Zehnder and Spencer Stuart. Steve is now on his own entrepreneurial journey. My condolences, Steve. Having been there. You're welcome. And as the president and co-founder of Ascent, which is essentially fast turning into a leader in the leadership field, you're going to talk to us about leadership. A lot of using of that word today, styles. And I guess the heroes throughout our favorite works of fiction, starting with the king himself, Aragorn, from The Lord of the Rings. And how I guess, I'm not sure you're going to like me saying this, is leadership style would fit in today's modern corporate culture. So later, after you're done with this, we'll be talking with Chris, Karen, and David. But right now, it's my honor to introduce you, Stephen Kelner.
Thanks, Gadi. Okay, so hi, I'm Steve from Ascent Leadership Networks. We're going to talk about how Aragorn leads. And in the course of lots of research into the characteristics of executives, what makes this possible is that the fact that we've only found really 6 key capabilities that pretty much everyone needs. And in fact, none of them should be a surprise. They're all intuitively, they make sense. And I'll summarize them in a single sentence, which is a leader drives results over the strategic long term through people. The complicated part is the through people, because that includes collaboration, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and development. So this is different from kings, is my argument here, and why I think Aragorn stands out, because kings were almost by definition command and control. You obeyed or you died. Now, of course, there were good kings, but my point would be that Aragorn actually looks more like a modern leader who rules with the willing consent of the governed. So I think Aragorn was like that, and I can show you why. So I mentioned there are 6 different characteristics, and I'm just going to show you what those are. So, and I said all of them make sort of obvious sense, right? Results, strategy, collaboration, leading groups, aligning organizations for change, and developing people and organizations. And we find these happen over and over again. Everybody seems to have them. And what makes it measurable is the fact that we go back and we look at people's behaviors. What do people do? And when you look at that, you can compare it to what other people do. The patterns of what people do, their behaviors, are a reliable measure of what you can predict that they'll do in the future. What's more, those 6 things I showed you actually can be scaled. So there's different degrees of behavior. So there's a difference between, for example, someone who wants to meet goals versus someone who wants to beat goals versus someone who implements new systems so higher goals are possible. And with those 2 characteristics, the behaviors and the scaling, we can actually look at people compared to each other. So I went through Aragorn and all the things he did in Lord of the Rings where they applied to leadership. Some of them didn't. You know, his ability to swing an axe was not necessarily important. But also what was described when he was a king in the appendices. And I scored them. And then I said, okay, well, who can I compare this to? Well, I can compare it to modern executives. And I have some numbers which are effectively about 50,000 people from all over the world who are all in senior leadership positions. And I picked someone else from Lord of the Rings who's actually in a similar role, and that would be Denethor, the steward of Gondor, who ruled as a king while the line of the original kings had died out. And stewards had been doing that for centuries. So he behaved much more like a conventional king. And when I looked at the behaviors of what they did, here's what I found. Just share this. So those are the 6 again. So if you look at this, it's pretty obvious that, and by the way, 1 level on this is a standard deviation for the stat geeks among us. That means 1 level is significantly different. And what you see is that Aragorn at the top is actually significantly better than the average executive, very significantly, in fact, since the gap is 1, 2, 3, roughly 4 levels or more across all the capabilities. I added a 7th here influence because it actually kind of predicts how you engage with people. The average executive you can see is somewhere between 3 and 4. But when you look at poor Denethor, what he's good at is focusing on results, as in defending Gondor, and on strategy, like, okay, how can I defend Gondor? But not at as high a degree as Aragorn, who's thinking about the whole world. And in some, he actually comes out negative. Right. So what does that mean? I'll show you some examples. This is what it looks like in terms of the descriptors we use on the scales. So Aragorn is someone who works to beat goals. He goes beyond what is expected of him. Whereas Denethor is someone who only works to meet goals. I've already talked a little about strategy. Aragorn tried to reshape the future of the world by forming alliances. Here's collaboration. He was actually partnered with some of what we now call a partnership. Some of the people who fought for Mordor, he not only made peace agreements, but he pardoned them. He pardoned the Easterlings who had given themselves up, and he sent them away free. And he made peace with the peoples of Harad, who had been enemies of Gondor for centuries. So that's kind of an extraordinary level of collaboration. Whereas Denethor, by contrast, once said that when asked, what would you like to have happen by Gandalf, he said, I would like things as they were, to be lord of this city in peace, and leave my chair to a son after me who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. But if doom denies this to me, that I will have naught. For him, it was my way or the highway. And this shows in leadership as well. So leading groups, how do you manage a team? How do you give them goals? Aragorn did things like he made the son of Denethor a prince of Ithilien. So he actually elevated him and made him and put him in charge of protecting Gondor from what remained in Mordor. So he empowered him to act. He gave him a strategic objective and said, it's yours. Whereas Denethor, by contrast, now I'm going to turn this off now so we can look at each other. It said, for example, he was the Lord of Gondor, he said, is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy. And to him there is no purpose higher than the good of Gondor. So that pattern here, you can see that Denethor is someone who basically said, I know what's right, I'm going to do what I think is right, and I don't care what anybody thinks or what anyone else involved. Aragorn was more modest, he was more humble, and he really genuinely tended to want to engage with people and be, a ruler who ruled with permission rather than by demand. And of course, in corporations, people can always theoretically quit, or they can rebel in other ways. So it's much closer to what we would now think of as a modern leader. And just to be clear, there obviously been good kings in the past who could do stuff like this. And Julius Caesar actually would score pretty well on most of these, but it wasn't necessarily expected of them. So that's where I would argue that Aragorn is someone who kind of goes above and beyond. And he, instead of investing everything in his ego, as did Denethor, where Denethor said, I'm Lord of Gondor and that's it. Even when being crowned king of Gondor and Arnor, Aragorn asked that Gandalf actually crown him because, and this was his exact words from the book, he has been the mover and this is his victory. And he started by saying that by the labor and valor of many, I have come into my inheritance. And I think that makes him a much more positive kind of leader. And you could see where even in today's world, this is the kind of guy who's going to say, who's good? How can I let them have power because they're going to do good things that maybe I can't do by myself? And believe that power is, that power shared is power multiplied. And that's what we see in the very best leaders. So that's my take on Aragorn based on the scores I've got. Hope you find that interesting. Gadi, shall I give it back to you?
Thank you. That was interesting. I appreciate that. Was that fun for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I love this kind of stuff. I mean, I've assessed thousands of senior executives. It's got to have some entertainment.
I have to admit, I mean, I should have put it in your introduction, but I still can't believe the numbers you get. When I interview people or used to interview people, and I believe that is true, but I also read about it a lot, the chances of getting any sort of assessment right is kind of random. And you managed to get 80% of your assessments right to the level of 2 years into the future where they're going to be in their career. I can't process that.
Well, we can predict who's going to be promoted a lot quickly versus who's going to be promoted a little versus who's just not going to get significantly better 5 years out with 85% accuracy. It's an issue of it's an issue of measurement, and it's trainable, right? It's no magic. I mean, it's using science, and that's what's kind of fun about this is applying science to fantasy.
Any sophisticated technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? Anyway,
there we go.
Let's bring in Chris, Karen, and David. And I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts to add to the discussion or things to ask Steve at this point.
Steve, that was delightful. One of the things that stands out to me is that Aragorn as a king was maybe a bit unusually elected relative to some other kings we've seen throughout history. How do you think that these traits or attributes helped him actually gain the authority to rule? Not only, like, do you feel he proved these traits in getting to the crown as well as, once he was ruling?
Yeah, it's a great point in that people wanted to work for him and with him, even people who weren't really in his kingdom. So, Legolas and Gimli were kind of stood in as examples at how much they referred to the love of the king. So they were willing to trust him, and that building of trust mattered. It's mentioned in Éomer too. At one point, he even says, it's in the appendices, but King Éomer, right, says, "I have loved you from the moment I saw you." And it's like, okay, maybe there's something else going on there, but also he was also a very transparent and honest and open person. So you understood that what he said he would do, and you could trust him. So yeah, I think that makes a huge difference, and that's true for leaders today. Especially now in the era of social media, because if you do something that's out of line with what you are saying, people will find out, and it will corrupt the organization from top to bottom.
It's funny, as the guy here who has never read Lord of the Rings.
Hold on, stop everything. Get off the show.
All right. But no, I spent a large chunk of my life actually studying Silicon Valley leadership groups.
Yes.
In particular, the CEOs of companies from 1974 through 1988.
Interesting.
And an amazingly interesting group that 100% did not believe in management. They believed in leadership. Mm-hmm. And it is because of those chuckleheads that we have Scrum today. Which is my next TED Talk is going to be Scrum, all the cult, none of the protein deficiency. But one of the interesting concepts that I have been wondering about is how does a leader of disparate factions manage to get results without denigrating one of the factions?
That's a great point. Actually, it's one thing Denethor does, by the way, is he denigrates people all the time. If you disagree with them, it's because you're wrong, or you're stupid, or you're weak. Well, part of it is you have to find what they do have in common. And that's what leaders do. They understand where people are coming from, and often they try to find what's the common thing that might underlie. Even if the way they're approaching things are different, they might say, look, we all want to get to this objective. Let's figure out a way that we can all agree. Right? And the assumption, they go in with the clear assumption that everybody has gifts. And if they're really good, they know what those gifts are already. So that way they can kind of draw people out based on what they're already good at. And that helps, because then if you can kind of delegate certain aspects to people who know what they're doing, it's, then you get a different kind of battle.
Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I have one more question about Aragorn. So we've talked about how he was in many ways actually a very effective leader. I'm curious what you think, if any, major missteps or poor leadership moments he made. What did he make any major fumbles along the way that stand out to you?
Tolkien described a few points where he thought he made tactical mistakes, like being trapped on Weathertop. In terms of being a leader, it's interesting that I think his weakness is his strength, is his humility, So there's a point where they're getting ready to march to Mordor basically to die in order to be a distraction for Frodo to throw the ring in the volcano, right? I mean, that's what he was facing. And he says, I don't claim any leadership right now. And I thought, okay, that's taking humility a little too far. And the prince from Prince Imrahil actually says, he is my king whether he wants it or not, and and goes on with it. But it's his strength in that he's willing to treat everybody as equals, right? I mean, he like bans human beings from the Shire. But it's also his weakness that sometimes he seems just a little too modest for his own good. That would be my argument.
I think that's a good moment to highlight. I don't, from everything I've known of leadership, I don't think it works quite that way.
Actually,
a mantle you can set down for a moment.
Well, the thing about being a CEO, which Gadi should know, is you have all the authority and none of the ability, right? If you're running a big company, everything comes back to you. It's all your fault, but you still can't go build the widgets. So a certain level of humility in the face of what do people actually do matters a lot. And I say the best ones are very empowering. And I have seen a few who actually were very, chairman of PepsiCo a few generations back once said, I'm really not very good at anything but picking people and then getting out of their way.
Well, Bill Gates is the exception.
Pardon?
Bill Gates is the exception. Bill Gates could build the widgets himself. He just didn't want to.
Well,
and he often did.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to cut this over short. I'll let David step in with a final note on the topic or on Tolkien or whatever he likes. But I will say a few things first. Number one, people, you can use the chat. We're happy to see what you're saying, and we are happy to answer your questions. And number two, next week, we have an entire show on leadership in crisis with chairs of Worldcon, security conventions, and conferences, as well as Steve himself coming back. So, Dave, any final words on this?
I've always been fascinated by Aragorn in that I think you're right. He did lead by example. He was out on the front lines. You know, he wasn't like, oh, someday I'm going to be king and I will save you all. It was no. He's out there marching around out in the swamps with his broken sword, trying to heal his people, and he won the respect of the people by doing that. So much so that I've often wondered, you know, gosh, what more is there about him? Why did these people love and want to work with him so much? And I almost feel like as a character, he's not as filled out as I would like to see. I think that there's probably more histories that that could have been written and played with.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, thank you all. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you coming on this impromptu panel. And now
there is a question in the chat. I don't know if we want
there is. You know what?
Yes.
Let's go for it. Let me see. Do you want to read it out if you've already seen it?
Sure. Not sure if Stephen has any specific knowledge on this topic, but to what extent do you believe Aragorn may have been inspired by British officers in the trenches of World War I? Well, it's a good question because a lot of British officers were appointed based on their family and whether they could buy in, not because of their leadership ability. There's no doubt that Tolkien had experience in the trenches, and he did have people he respected in there. So if it was inspired by British officers, it was particular British officers, probably not the general British officer.
Oh, fair enough. You know, often World War I is... Okay, I'm stopping myself right there before we go down that rabbit hole.